Okay, Chapter 3, Eisley. Before Eisley could protest or explain, the whole thing had been a new employee initiation, aka dare, instigated by Betty Ford. I'm going to start over. Before Eisley could protest or explain, the whole thing had been a new employee initiation, aka dare, instigated by Betty. Ford got to his feet. He towered over both her and the sun-baked guy who'd asked her on a date. A scar that must have happened after high school ran from Ford's outer left eyebrow and through what had once been his perfect cheekbone. However, it didn't quite reach the strong edge of his jawline. "She's taken," Ford said. The other guy skulked back to his table. "I'm taken? No, Ford, I'm confused," she hissed. She gazed around the dining room. "And I'm at work. It's my first day. This is just—" She waved his order slip between them. "It's unbelievable." She wandered toward the order window in a daze. After slapping the slip down and shouting, "Order in," she started to get him the soda he'd requested. Asking him what kind of soda was silly because he'd always just drank carbonated water with a squeeze of lemon, and it always reminded him of what life gave him, a little spin on the common saying about when life gives you lemons. She was his lemonade, her, their friendship. When Ford said soda, he literally meant soda water unless that had changed. It seemed so much had. He'd always been strong and athletic. He'd played football in high school, but the man at table 8 was another beast altogether. She wondered if being in the military had hardened him up on the inside as much as on the outside. It must have, considering he didn't reach out to her for over 10 years. "Wow, you move fast," Claudia said with a laugh as Eisley tallied up a slip for another customer. "The girl skips pleasantries, awkwardness, and flirting," Betty said. She moved right into the embrace. Billy's eyebrow arched. "He's quite the specimen," Betty said, "and you already have competition." Betty indicated the other guy who'd approached her. "I'd hardly say there was competition there," Billy smirked. "No, no," Eisley said, waving her hands in front of them. "Ford and I are friends." She swallowed hard and corrected herself. "We were friends. This is a story I want to hear right after I bring table 3 yet another fork. It's the third that the lady's dropped since she sat down. I think she just wants me to earn my tip. Dang tourists." Betty scowled and scooted away. "Claudia, will you bring him his drink?" Eisley asked the other new girl. "Order up, Claudia," the cook shouted. Claudia bit her teeth together, revealing the perfect gap between the first two. "I'm sorry, Eisley. I forgot to put in another order, and my table has been getting cranky while waiting." Eisley reluctantly brought forward his soda water with lemon. His elbows rested on the table, and his hands were stacked with his chin resting against his massive fists. "Thanks." "Eyes," he said, calling her by the nickname that sounded the same as the beginning of her name that he'd started using after she tried to explain how to pronounce her name. "When do you get off your shift?" he asked. She shrugged. "I literally started today, so I have no idea." "I'll be waiting." His voice was even deeper than she remembered. Her shoulders dropped. No, she needed to process his return to her life, never mind the fact that she'd driven about 20 hours in the last 2 days, discovered paradise, and moved in with her mother. But she'd waited over 10 years to see him again, and if he was willing to meet with her, if she wasn't at risk of falling asleep, she'd do whatever it took to find out what had happened between them. When she returned to the area behind the counter, the others were waiting. "So, tell us about your first date." "Wait, have you dated him before?" Betty asked, raising and lowering her eyebrows. "No, we never dated," Eisley answered. "He looks very dateable," Billy said with a wink, playing along. The girls gathered around the soda machine that hummed and muffled their voices. "He was the boy next door, raised by his father. He had 2 brothers who were troublemakers. Their house was constant chaos. I think he enjoyed hanging out with my mom and me, although she's her own brand of crazy." Betty laughed. "My daughters would say the same about me." "You have kids?" Claudia asked. 5. 3 boys and 2 girls. 12 grandchildren and 9 great-grandbabies and counting. Betty beamed. "Talk about chaos. But let's hear more about Ford. It's a good, strong name." "We were friends for over a decade. Then he disappeared for a decade. Now he pops up here of all places." She went on to explain how he'd ignored her calls and letters for years. She'd only given up that last Christmas, but mostly she didn't send a card because she couldn't afford it, and she wasn't sure if his father still lived at his old address. Diana said she hadn't seen him for about a month before she'd moved to Florida. "Things have a way of washing ashore in Blue Bay Beach. Some say it's fate." Betty gazed toward the sea. "That's what Ford said," Eisley recalled his comment. "Or is it destiny?" Billy asked as she restocked the napkin dispenser. "What's the difference?" Claudia wiped down the salt and pepper shakers. "Most people believe that fate is something which has been predetermined. It is fixed, while the path we choose to take and the choices we make can influence destiny. But both agree on one thing. Whatever happens is inevitable." Betty shrugged. "Who cares? He's a whole lot of man muscle," a customer said as she breezed by. The 4 women broke into laughter. "That is true," Claudia said. Either way, he's here and you're here. Are you going to go on a date with him? Betty bounced on her toes. I'm upset, hurt. He brushed me off and basically threw away 10 years of friendship. I'm not going to date him. I'm going to give him an earful. Eisley's jaw tightened. The dare was a date, Betty said. Claudia is next, then Billy. She bumped the restaurant owner on the hip. If Betty weren't petite and older, Eisley was quite sure Billy would have bumped her back, landing her smack on her backside. Clearly, Billy was not interested in dating. Neither was she. I don't date customers, Billy said. No, dear, you don't date, period. I'd like to see that change before I'm too old. Billy grumbled and wandered off at the same time the cook called Eisley's order. She occupied her mind with how Billy was nice enough, but not the kind of person she'd want to see genuinely upset. Owning and managing a restaurant took some grit, and even though her hands were clean, she seemed to have a bit of it under her nails. She'd never want to be on Billy's bad side, that was for sure. Eisley set the plate of food in front of Ford. Do you want a drink refill? Do you want a few fries? He offered, nudging the plate toward her. She was a sucker for French fries, and he knew it. She took one just so he'd have one fewer. She fought against sticking her tongue out at him like a petulant child. Do you want to sit down? He asked. I'm working, Ford, she ground out through clenched teeth. She had to be strong and not give in to the handsome, familiar man sitting in front of her. Then I'll take my time. He made a show of spreading his napkin slowly on his lap as though at a fancy 7-course meal. She sighed. I've had a super long day. Can we meet tomorrow or never? As minutes passed, she wanted to retreat and not revisit the pain and confusion of losing her best friend who left without an explanation. As much as she wanted to talk to him and hear his side of the story, she became equally afraid of what she'd hear. What she knew to be true, what she'd proven. She was no better at keeping money in her bank account than she was at keeping a decent man in her life, whether as a friend or more. Can I have your number? He asked. He pulled out his phone and passed it to her. The password screen appeared. She typed in her birthday without thinking because that was her code. The phone opened up. Eisley shifted back on her heels. Ford's eyes locked on hers, causing her stomach to churn and a knot to form in her throat. Why would he have her birthday as his phone password? It must have been a coincidence, just like everything that day, not kismet, as her mother had mentioned, or fate, or even destiny. She punched in her number and then went back to refill his water. The glass overflowed because she couldn't stop thinking about Ford. The cut of his jaw and the scar that nearly reached it, the way his eyes sparkled when he looked at her but turned flat when he glanced away. When they were younger, they'd been the kinds of friends who knew the locations of moles and freckles and how his second toe was longer than the big one. He was privy to the fact that there was a spot just below her rib cage that was always ticklish. What had happened? What kept him away? As Eisley returned to the counter, she felt his long, lingering gaze. Her coworkers all stared at him like they were about to swoon. Her nerves were as frayed as the ropes on the dock. I need something sweet. Eisley's eyes landed on a pie in a refrigerated case. Pie, oh pie, please, does that count as a meal on my shift? She asked. Teddy was already cutting her a piece. One slice and all is right, that's what I always say. She cut a second piece and delivered it to Ford's table. Eisley groaned when she heard Betty say the pie was on the house. In fact, he glanced over his massive shoulder in her direction, but she quickly ducked behind the soda machine. At last, he went to the register to pay his tab. Eisley nearly charged him $1,000 as her shaky hand stabbed the keys on the machine. I'll call you, he said as he took the change, but left the bills for a tip. Then he sauntered down the dock. After they closed for the night, the four women cleaned up and then sat at a table by the window open to the ocean. The warm breeze was soothing, and as Eisley finished her pie, she realized there were worse places she could be. So, we know about your former flame, Betty started. Ford is not my former flame. I stand corrected. Your current flame, Betty giggled. He's not my anything other than my ex-friend. Betty and Billy exchanged grins. The older woman looked up at Eisley over her glasses as she tallied the tips. Stay in this business long enough and you start to recognize things. Love, for instance, is one of those things that's almost impossible to explain or understand, but it marks people in a unique way that's almost visible if you know what to look for. Love, Eisley stammered. Love, Betty repeated. Billy rolled her eyes. Claudia looked on as though the conversation was about as comfortable as being thrown in the ocean fully dressed on a winter's day. Eisley shoved the last bite of pie in her mouth. So, tell us what brought you here, Billy said, getting the conversation back on track. I lost my job in Baltimore. This is just temporary until Eisley wasn't sure how to finish the sentence. What did you do there? Claudia asked. I worked in the office at a car valet. She then went on to list the dozen jobs she'd had over the years that barely kept her rent and bills paid. As she looked at the last decade of her life, she'd been in a sort of limbo, not using her degree because that meant committing to something. It was as though she was waiting for something to happen or maybe someone to return to her life. I'm not sure what I want to do when I grow up, she whispered. Those were the same words she'd spoken to Ford during one of their last conversations. He was preparing for the Marines, and she was getting ready for college, but hadn't declared her major. They'd been going over ideas along with her strengths and interests. She'd never committed and simply got a liberal arts degree. What was that? Betty asked. I don't know what I want to do when I grow up, which is a problem since I'm nearly 30. They all started chattering about their various careers. Billy was basically born into the restaurant biz. Betty was a people person and worked a couple of shifts a week so she didn't drive her husband mad. Claudia was a musician and in the process of getting her master's degree in music theory. I always told my kids to dream big, but plan big too, because life can happen even when you're not asleep. So be awake on your feet. Take action to bring your dreams to life. Betty smiled softly, then tucked her tips into her purse. As Eisley rode her bike back to the cottage that night, all she wanted to do was sleep, but she remained on the steps of the porch, reflecting on the day and Betty's words about fate, destiny, and love. Dreaming big but planning and taking action floated around in her mind. The scent of coconut wafted in the air, and she had a sudden craving for ice cream.